afternoon and welcome to this week's Halftime Talk. We're absolutely honored to be joined by Marc Holtzman, the Chairman of the Board of Directors of the Bank of Kigali and the Chairman of CBZ Holdings, also operating in the African region. Marc, good afternoon.
Well, Sean, good afternoon to you, and it's a great pleasure to appear with you.
It's a unique chance for our audience to get some insights as to how Africa, and particularly East Africa, South Africa, Southern Africa, is contending with this great COVID pandemic. We're hearing a lot about the European American experience, the Asian experience, but little about Africa, which is maybe a good thing. That tells us it hasn't been badly hit. But Marc, before we get into how COVID has impacted East Africa and Southern Africa, what was the picture before February, March this year? There was a lot of very positive headlines coming out of places like Rwanda.
Yeah, so for example, under President Kagame's extraordinary exemplary leadership, there has been incredible innovation and gains in Rwanda. I've been associated with the bank on the board and most recently chairman for the last 11 years. And in that time, I've seen the largest bank in the country, Bank of Kigali, grow from a tiny government-owned bank of about 200 million US in assets to over $1 billion US in assets, achieve impressive profitability, and most importantly, to financially include a whole segment of the population that was simply missing. I mean, I'll give you one example. We have a program in Rwanda called ICOFI, and we've identified that out of a population of 12 million people, 2 million are farmers in one form or another, from larger co-ops to mom and pop family farms with a little plot. We had a team of 25 people, Sean, for over 2 years that were working diligently to catalog these people, to understand how many hectares they had under cultivation, what they were growing, what their annual seed and fertilizer inputs were, and even the unique identifier number of their land plot. Rwanda has a very advanced land registry, maybe the most advanced on the continent. And then we got mobile phone numbers and where emails existed for those people. And then we went to the Ministry of Finance and Agriculture, and we determined that they are producing 9 million pieces of paper a year to manually do the seed and fertilizer subsidies and other inputs where the government supports. So then we went to the government, we said, let us privatize this, which they're now doing through us. And the good news is we have information on 1.3 million of 2 million farmers, and we've converted over 300,000 to fee-paying customers of the Bank of Kigali. I mean, we'll do micro loans.
Is there a case, and it's certainly something that struck me in recent years, that the sort of absence of legacy infrastructure and the burden of that has allowed a lot of innovation to happen in the financial sector in Africa, East Africa, and as you say, in the area of agriculture and finance. So what is your thoughts on how that has helped and what's the outlook for that?
Sean, there's no question that you're absolutely right. I'll give you several examples. And we're finding now in this COVID environment that there's even more of an acceleration to the online tools for both payment settlements, processing, even micro loans, which we're routinely doing through this platform. And you're absolutely correct that digitalization of the currency in most countries in Africa is a tremendous opportunity. And there's no question that Africa is leading the US, Europe, and the more developed world simply because these countries, if you look at the banking system in the US, JP Morgan, Wells Fargo, they're in a sense the victims of their own success. I can do much more over our app in both at Bank of Kigali and also at CBZ, Commercial Bank of Zimbabwe, where I'm also chairman. We can do much more over our apps than you could ever do on one of these US platforms. And I'll give you one other example, transferring money. There are companies like Western Union, which I consider to be confiscatory almost predatory dinosaurs. And let me explain what I mean. So we have a nanny from the Philippines, and if she wants to go to Western Union to send money back home, they'll take up to 6 or 7% as a fee, which should be illegal in most jurisdictions.
It's like a credit card.
Oh, it's worse. It's worse. And then there are companies like TransferWise out of the United Kingdom and a whole new entrants into the market that are secure, stable, excellent reputations. They'll charge a small fraction of 1%. So if you're Western Union, and even if you want to compete with this, I don't believe you can. And again, I think you're the victim of your own success. Even if you wanted to cut your fees by half, their cost structure wouldn't allow it. So at some point, somebody's going to put these companies, in the grave where they belong.
I mean, going into the COVID period, obviously March, the second quarter this year, which is now, down in the history books already as one of the most devastating periods of economic collapse the world has seen outside of wartime. East Africa, Rwanda, and other similar fast-growing economies in East Africa went into this looking pretty good, having 5-6% growth rates. Ethiopia looking incredibly well. How has the COVID period impacted the momentum that your bank and obviously Zimbabwe is a little bit unique, having come out of its recent history, but the rest of that corner of Africa, how have they survived this window of time?
It's been difficult for every country in the world, and surely for countries in Africa as well. But having said that, in countries like Rwanda, for instance, they didn't miss a beat. I mean, they were ahead of the problem. They were dealing with it. The banking system is strong and secure. And I believe that in some ways, when the dust settles, countries like Rwanda, Zimbabwe, and others will be even stronger, Sean. Let me explain what I mean. There's no question that there will be a rationalization of these supply chains, and that China, which had so dominated in India and other countries in pharmaceuticals, for instance, that there will be a recognition that it is a national security imperative that some of these supply chains be regionalized, not brought back to every country, but certainly in the case of Africa, to certain regions in Africa. So if you look at the East African community, which now has about 180 million citizens, representing half a dozen countries, including Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania.
180 million.
Yes. And if you're setting up in those countries, why would you go anywhere else other than Rwanda? Because in Rwanda, you have an absence of corruption, you have complete transparency, you have ease of operations, and you can set up a company in a matter of hours. You can do it even online.
And that group of countries operates under a common acronym. I think it's ESCWA, is it?
Yeah, well, it's the East African Community, and in the East African Community, you have a customs union. You have even discussion going on now about a common currency at some point in the future, although I don't think it'll happen anytime in the immediate term. But there's a lot of cooperation and goodwill, and in fact,
a lot of Middle Eastern energy investors have been drawn to the region in recent years.
Yes, we see a lot of Middle Eastern groups pursuing even alternative energy sources like solar. You have a lot of oil and gas exploration in Uganda, in Kenya, and elsewhere in the region. And most people think this is just the start.
And would it be your view coming out of COVID, or at least coming out of this critical window of the COVID, that as international companies reconsider supply chains that have been heavily dependent on China, that they might look at centers in East Africa as possible, at least for the African market?
There's no doubt. And Rwanda will be at the top of the list of beneficiaries. I mean, it's already happened even pre-COVID. I mean, Volkswagen set up a huge assembly facility. They're producing 3 models for the continent. there are many, many instances of the advances which have taken place in the agricultural, the dairy sector in Rwanda, and this is just the beginning.
Are these economies a bit like the Middle East, overly dependent on commodities, on agriculture, on energy? What's their profile?
I don't think so. Rwanda is about 30% of the economy in Rwanda, and also coincidentally about the same number. When I'm involved as chairman of the largest bank lending to agriculture, even though it was 30% of the economy, was only about 6% of total bank lending. And Diane Karasisi, the CEO of the bank, who has done a tremendous job, and I have really pushed the bank and our team. And right now our lending to the agricultural sector has dramatically increased.
Perhaps, Mark, you could give us a brief insight into how Zimbabwe has been progressing. It's kind of since the end of the long reign of the former leader, it's kind of gone off the headlines, if you like. Maybe that's a good thing. But ultimately, Zimbabwe used to be the garden basket of Africa, full of riches and great wealth and success. What is it looking like now, and where do you think it's going post this COVID crisis?
Well, Sean, you're absolutely right. It was one time considered the breadbasket of Africa, and now it's a net importer of vital food commodities, which it once exported widely. Zimbabwe should be the richest country in Africa. It is abundantly blessed in natural resources. It's said to be the richest nation in the world as measured by mineralization per square kilometer. One of the challenges is to convert that wealth in the ground to the benefit of the population. There's no doubt that the country's gone through great hardship, and after 38 years of a virtual dictatorship. The new president, Emerson Mnangagwa, is incredibly impressive, very committed to democratic and social reforms. The first thing he did was to open diamonds and platinum, the diamond and platinum mining business to foreign investment. It had been closed under Mugabe for nearly 40 years. He has given a very generous package, $350 million in the first tranche to white farmers that were forcibly removed or dispossessed of their land holdings. And not to sound immodest, but it was a big move for him to reach out to somebody like me who had no roots in Zimbabwe at the time, but a reputation I hope for, cleaning up and turning around and transforming and modernizing banks in frontier emerging markets, to give me a free hand to do the things that have needed to be done to bring the bank into the 21st century.
If you look at countries like Zimbabwe or Rwanda or others in your neighborhood, there's a certain perception from the world and from the Middle East that China's already got that place locked up, and that the African leadership in those countries have kind of been compelled, due to the lack of access to capital elsewhere, to turn to the Chinese. Could you give us a sense of that narrative? Is it wrong? What is the outlook for it?
It's right and it's wrong. It's right in that China has been very aggressive. I mean, for instance, 20 years ago, the Export-Import Bank of the United States made $20 billion in loans. Last year, they made $20 billion in loans. 20 years ago, China's one export credit finance agency made $3 billion in loans globally. Last year, China's 5 export credit finance agencies made $273 billion in loans. So they're extremely aggressive. They're very present, but at the same time,
and as they're offering debt forgiveness in parts of Africa.
Yeah, they are in some instances, but in other places, people were quite traumatized by the experience of the Sri Lankans, who took an $8 billion loan to create a port, and all of a sudden, guess what? They no longer own their port. And some people feel that the approach of China can be a mixed blessing. I mean, they're there, but but they always have their own strategic interests, first, second, and third. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but if you're looking at American investment, European investment, and Western investment, it's often more of a partnership investment, and it's more designed to, of course, advance the interests of
I mean, what
those
is the
countries.
US and European investors not seeing? Or they obviously, this is now a different moment, but pre-COVID, we've seen Africa at 6% growth over the last decade or more. European and American companies, bar the fringes, seem to be pretty absent from that great opportunity.
Sean, it breaks my heart because I come from the United States, and nothing would please me more than to see, America play a much bigger and impactful role in Africa. But the point is, and this is not just only President Trump, but America has really been very slow to realize the opportunity for American businesses. For instance, in Africa right now, you have, of course, more than 1 billion people and a middle class of more than 100 million people. But that middle class in the next 5 to 7 years is going to be about 250 million people. You'll have as big a middle class in Africa in no more than a decade than you have in the United States and Europe. So it's very short-sighted for companies and businesses and countries not to focus on Africa. I mean, I read many suggestions that have been made, policy suggestions over the years, that the US should encourage entrepreneurs to go to Africa. They should almost make their income tax exempt for X years. Do whatever is needed to be done to encourage the American economic footprint. But it's very hard to.
Well, in
American
the
investment.
aftermath of COVID, as we go forward now, and one looks for growth and looks for something that, never mind big growth, but it's just positive growth. We've seen yesterday the headlines out of Singapore: 40% contraction of the Singapore economy. Europe is looking at, most countries, at contraction of 10% this year. Africa over the next few years may offer one of the rare few centers of growth. What is your outlook, your prognosis? I know you're focused in Rwanda and Zimbabwe. What is their outlook post-COVID? How damaging is this period? What's the outlook for that region as a whole, do you think?
Yeah, Sean, if I may, I just want to go back and finish one thought. I
Yep.
really believe that in Rwanda, you see a much more diversified collection of investment, strong American presence, strong European presence, strong Indian presence, Chinese presence, very powerful and strong. It's countries like Zimbabwe where the policy of the West is almost to insist that they become like Canada in one step before they'll even be considered to be a trading and investment partner. And it's so unrealistic. What should be happening is the excellent performance of people like President Mnangagwa should be incrementally rewarded. And I don't see any evidence that that's taking place
Is there a risk, just coming back to the China point? We're seeing in more developed economies the move towards the choice, the binary choice. But Washington is insisting you choose between Huawei and other, that increasingly, as China and the US face off, countries in Africa might find themselves having to choose between one or the other, as we did, and as Africa suffered greatly during the Cold War in that dichotomy between the Soviet Union and the West.
It would be a terrible mistake for that choice to be so binary. I hope it doesn't happen like that.
Yeah, well, the signs are that it's starting to manifest in certain places. We'll have to keep an eye on. We're watching it here in the Middle East as well, that it may transpire in that respect. That particularly around the use of technology, we're seeing it in countries out in Australia and New Zealand are facing some challenges from the positions they've taken vis-a-vis China.
Yes, yes. I want to just say one thing about Chinese investment. A lot of Chinese investment is very positive, and there are a lot of Chinese investors that have a long-term outlook. But there are a few cases where, for instance, they might win a mining contract, and then they bring in thousands of Chinese miners, and they have their own little communities that are almost self-supporting. And don't really contribute to the overall economy as much as one would hope. So I think in some ways, hopefully China will have learned from that experience that that's not the way to do things. And they will change and adapt in a more partnership-friendly way. But it would be a terrible, terrible mistake for the West to.
If there are the sort of, as you say, the expectations on a country like Zimbabwe to being, you've got to be as pure as Canada as some kind of benchmark. I would say Ireland, maybe, I don't know, but nonetheless, something that has a generally positive transparency and economic culture. For those that are paying attention, first mover advantage must be offering great results or great opportunities in Zimbabwe.
Yes, there's no question. And I'll tell you, two countries that really realize that are Turkey and India. And you see a big presence from both of those countries, for instance, in Zimbabwe.
In what particular sectors?
Construction, mining, in technology,
Just
pharmaceuticals in the case of India.
if we might wrap up, Mark, and just talk a little bit around where the energy play is in that region and in your particular countries, but what is the outlook there?
So Rwanda did something completely unique. A company named, called Contour Global invested over $400 million, the biggest U.S. investment in Rwanda, to create a methane to electricity system. And they're producing about 125 megawatts, but I understand they expect to go up to about 500 megawatts production. And under Lake Kivu, the big lake that is between the Democratic Republic of Congo and Rwanda, is one of the world's largest methane reserves. And they're taking this methane and they're using completely new experimental technology. In fact, when they started about 15 years ago, wasn't even sure that this could scientifically be done, but it is working. It's proving to be very cost effective. And it is another example of the innovativeness of President Kagame and the Rwandan leadership to really seize the opportunity and to look to become self-sufficient and do new things.
Well, it's certainly, it's interesting you giving sort of top grades to the leadership of Rwanda, and that's certainly been recognized over the years. It does feel like a period of time post-COVID that good leadership is more critical than ever. We're seeing so many examples of the opposite, that bad leadership is delivering inadequate reaction and responses to the great COVID challenge, whereas positive leadership, good leadership is making a big difference. And perhaps countries that are fortunate enough to have that might do better in the journey out of this particular trauma. Listen, Mark, I'm going to leave it there, and thank you so much for joining us on Halftime Talk this week. Marc Holtzman, the chairman of Bank of Kigali in Rwanda. It's great to get some insights into that part of the world, a very critical part for our Middle East stakeholders, of building a strong relationship with East Africa and Southern Africa, given the proximity of the two regions. Hopefully bridges will return to being built that were being built pre-COVID.